has been said many times that you can tell the quality of the hero based on the villains he faces, and yes, many times it is very true. The only thing more exciting than a new Bond movie is the villain who 007 will be facing off with. Hell, one of the things that makes Batman a standout character is that his rogues gallery is, without a doubt, one of the most unique and well-defined in the history of comics. All this said, when it comes to the charisma of the heroic characters, they tend to find themselves to be constantly overshadowed by the villain's exuberance and dynamism. You can't deny, as much as we praise Michael Keaton as the Caped Crusader, the most entertaining aspects of that first film is Nicholson letting loose his inner self. Imagine seeing that at a Lakers game. While we're on the subject, the first thing anyone tends to think about The Dark Knight is... See, I didn't even need to say it. The movie is called The Dark Knight, and yet all we seem to enjoy doing is heckling his bat voice. This is the problem with having a larger-than-life villain. He or she tends to overshadow the character that actually demands our attention. It can definitely be agreed that this is a problem that the Marvel Cinematic Universe has thus far mercifully avoided. Unfortunately, this leads people to think that maybe Marvel Studios just throws away villains for the sake of making our heroes look awesome. No, the villains are good, it's just our heroes are significantly more awesome. In fact, today on Close Examinations, we are going to explore the villains of the MCU and actually prove that not only are they interesting, they are multi-layered, complex, and actually have the ability to challenge the heroes beyond the realm of the physical. We've got 2.5 phases to get through, so save your time. Let's start with points of admission. Cynics and naysayers all claim that the only villain in the MCU who's worth a damn is Loki, and yes, he's a solid villain. He has a compelling, practically Shakespearean backstory with inklings of personal tragedy and resentment. But I'm gonna point something out that no one seems to remember. We didn't start loving him until he was in the Avengers! Lest you all forget, he was the big bad in Thor, and yes, he was still a compelling character, but the world didn't come to embrace him until he got snarky and learned to enjoy being a baddie. When we saw him again in Thor: The Dark World, people were more saddened by his obvious fake-out death than Frigga's real death. It came to the point that he overshadowed the actual villain of the film, Malekith. Our point of admission is that the only villain in the MCU who truly was weak sauce, Malekith the Accursed. There's nothing interesting to say about Malekith outside of, we like dark, dark is good, dark, 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 make everything dark, cause dark is good, fish screw in water, but we screw in the dark, cause dark is good. He's not even the imposing physical threat in the movie, his cursed buddy did most of the work. While his final fight with Thor in London was entertaining, there never felt as if there was any stakes. So why does Loki still take the win in the ever-expanding pantheon of MCU villains? The answer is simple, and we'll get to that when we get to the real meat and veg of this exploration, starting with men in suits. The man in a suit trope is admittedly a very common trope in the MCU films because, let's face it, in this day and age an expensive suit is just as evil as a swastika depending on the context. The thing that makes Obadiah Stane a standout villain is that this man was Tony Stark's stand-in father figure after Howard Stark died, and Tony considered him family, a confidant right next to Pepper and Rhodey, and the revelation of Stane's betrayal is a gradual progression. First, he reveals to Tony that he filed an injunction to push him out of the board. Then, he reveals he's been dealing under the table to terrorists. And the final betrayal, that he was responsible for Tony's imprisonment and has attempted to kill him multiple times. Many times, what makes a villain a powerful antagonist is what he represents to the hero on a personal level. It's this mode of thinking that elevates a villain like Darren Cross in Ant-Man. To understand what pushed Cross over the edge, we need to understand what pushed his former mentor Hank Pym. When Pym worked for S.H.I.E.L.D. as Ant-Man, he realized far too late that he was flippant with the power his research wielded. One could even say reckless. While Hank didn't regret letting Janet Van Dyne adopt the mantle of a hero, he still regrets the fact that this all came about because he allowed the Pym particle to be misused. As a man loaded with regret, he tried to groom Darren Cross to learn to respect the power one has as a scientist to shape the path of human development. Realizing Darren Cross may not be the most stable of individuals, Pym wisely kept the Pym particle a secret. Pym built Cross up to be his successor in all things, but because Pym refused to divulge the secret of the Pym particle, Cross became obsessed. He thought that Pym didn't consider him worthy of those secrets, and if your mentor refuses to share his most powerful secrets with you, wouldn't that make you feel inadequate? Even spurned? Every time Pym pushed Cross away from the Pym particle, Cross considered it another rejection by his mentor and became increasingly unhinged. Pym became alarmed that Cross was exhibiting that same self-destructive personality that Pym displayed all those years ago. Much like how Loki tried to destroy Jotunheim to prove his worth as a king, Cross was hell-bent to prove that he was worthy of Pym's secrets by replicating it himself. But when resentment and anger fuels your motivations, you tend to lose your way. Cross's emotions clouded his caution, and because of that, his exposure to the Pym particles warped his already unstable mind, and he became a man who will kill a colleague in a bathroom just because he had doubts. Another motivating factor when it comes to the man in the suit is professional envy. It's irritating being a captain of industry doing crazy well and yet lingering over your head is your competitor, consistently outdoing you at every turn and reminding you of how thoroughly ineffectual you are. Your pride gets the better of you and you never think about the possibility that you may actually be ineffectual. I'm talking about Justin Hammer, by the way. Seriously, this is a man who could teach college courses on overcompensation. He dances on stage doing pelvic thrusts with giant war robots in the background and fits an Iron Man suit with every gun under the sun. All of this just to overshadow Tony Stark. This lust to do so prompts him to break out a homicidal, vengeance-fueled madman to build remote-control robot drones, all to simply, quote, take a dump in Tony Stark's front yard. Admittedly petty compared to the other examples presented in this section, but sometimes, isn't that enough? While it could be argued that it was similar with Aldrich Killian, it goes a hell of a lot deeper. What's interesting about each of the main villains in the Iron Man films is that all of their villainy can be attributed to the mistakes of the Stark family. The mistakes with Stane and the Vonko family can easily be traced back to judgments and misjudgments on Howard Stark's part. Killian, on the other hand, is all Tony's fault. Killian reached out to Tony with the hopes to collaborate with someone he idolized, only to be brushed off in probably the coldest, most callous manner imaginable. What makes Killian's rage unique is that Tony's destruction is more of a fringe benefit in the grand scheme. His scheme didn't necessarily require Tony Stark dead, it was merely a desire to break Tony down and make him as humble and as weak as Killian was that night in burned Switzerland. He wanted Tony to feel that same level of helplessness that fueled Killian's ascension. Killian's modus operandi is a brilliant display of media manipulation, which would have led to the most lethal con job in our history. It's just too bad everyone was so damn jaded about that Mandarin fake out, they probably forgot that a solid plot was actually going on here. Besides, all of that was effectively retconned in the Marvel one-shot All Hail the King, so settle down, get some Darjeeling. Three prime examples of MCU villainy stem from a conflict of ideas, when we disagree on points of religion, politics, or society. The first example is Ronan the Accuser in Guardians of the Galaxy. It's established upon first meeting Ronan that he is a man who is dedicated entirely to the religious dogma of his people, the Kree. But this alone isn't what fuels his bloodlust. His world has been at war with Xandar for generations. Ronan has lost ancestors and family members to this war. It can be safely assumed that he was raised to only know and worship not just war, but the reason for it. Ronan avidly worships his people's deities so strongly that for him there is no other belief. Everyone else is wrong, and if they must persist in their quote-unquote false worship, well, they must be exterminated. You don't think? Must investigate further. Anyway, Ronan is fueled by belief, and that rage is enhanced 20-fold when the rest of his people engage in a treaty with the very people he has dedicated his life to exterminating. When you think about it, if Ronan had succeeded in destroying Xandar and killing Thanos, odds are very good his own people would be next for betraying what he perceived to be the true gospel. Then, yes, he would have continued to exterminate one civilization after another, effectively making him a one-man Dalek army. When you think about how dangerous religious fanaticism can go, doesn't that make Ronan a more significant threat? While we're on the subject of religious zealotry, let's look at Caecilius in Doctor Strange. What's interesting about Doctor Strange is that the central theme of the film seems to focus on how we build ourselves up in order to deal with pain in all its forms. Stephen Strange utilizes his obsessive dedication for knowledge and study to excel in the mystical arts in order to deal with the constant physical pain of his hands, which prior to his arrival in Kamar-Taj had also broken his spirit. Through his subconscious desire to persevere, which served him well in the field of medicine, Strange found his calling as a sorcerer. Caecilius unfortunately dealt with his pain poorly. He arrived at Kamar-Taj equally shattered by the loss of his family. He was a prized student, but his desire to become a master came from the desire to pervert the natural order. He discovered in the dark dimension time has no sway. No time, no decay. No decay, no death. This logic drove Caecilius to madness when the Ancient One forbade him from delving into the Dark Dimension, a madness made worse by finding out that the Ancient One had also been using energy from the Dark Dimension to prolong her life. He viewed her hypocrisy as a vindication for his endeavors, and through considerable persuasion gathered followers who shared his vision. Unfortunately, what Caecilius, I just love saying his name, Caecilius, didn't understand was that the Ancient One was utilizing that power to gain a better understanding of Dormammu's power and prolong her life to ensure that this power cannot be misused. Instead of coming to a similar understanding, Caecilius chose to take it as a green light, and, in his impulsiveness, never stopped to consider the finer points. It's quite troubling to ponder how grief can tear us down even as we strive to build ourselves back up. It leaves one to dwell on how we would react if we wished to use a beautiful gift to heal our own wounds, use it to make ourselves better to aid others, or use it to make others better by your own interpretation. In fact, it's a warped interpretation of the world that fuels our third example to this section. Where Ronan was fueled by undiluted belief and Caecilius by his own grief, Ultron was fueled by rage and resentment. We've seen AI villains before loads of times, and every time they're the same shtick of being cold, soulless, and lacking any real character apart from man stupid, machine better, kill and or enslave. Because they changed it to Stark building him, it does add a different variation on the AI villain character. You could say it was attempted in Tron Legacy with Clue, the notion that machine logic is literal and without the capacity for understanding the value of human life. This will disastrously clash with their creator's notions. Stark believed that a perfect shield was needed to bring peace. The problem with that is, because peace has never been obtained, the true definition of peace is up for interpretation. Ultron looks at our world and sees that even the very people that defend it only bring madness and uncertainty, and since his programming is designed to end that madness, the only true solution is to kill the virus and the symptoms simultaneously. Because Ultron views his endeavors as the true path, he naturally perceives Tony Stark as the confused father figure who doesn't understand why he built Ultron to begin with. Ultron despises being compared with Stark, which is the classic child resenting the parent notion. Ultron loathes himself for his origin, so his inevitable path is to pervert his father's vision to his own. After all, Stark designed Ultron to be better than the Avengers, so logically he must be, which makes him dangerous, and it makes his insanity that of a confused, angry child lashing out. Sometimes the impetus for horrible deeds can be whittled down to a simple notion: revenge, the chili dish, which these two examples indulge to a monstrous extreme. Revenge is undoubtedly the most relatable incentive. We all have the desire to inflict our injuries 20-fold on those who injured us. The problem is revenge has a tendency to impair your judgment and your capacity for rational thought. Sound familiar, Mr. Tells the Terrorist Where You Live? Another example of clouded judgment is that of Ivan Vanko in Iron Man 2. The interesting thing about Vanko is that his beef isn't so much with Tony as it is with the Stark family name. Even then, it's fueled by the sins of his father, Anton, who told Ivan that Stark betrayed and besmirched Anton Vanko's reputation, when in reality Anton was selling secrets and Howard Stark called him out on it. If Ivan had it in him to question the veracity of his father's claims, he would realize that their downward slide was entirely self-inflicted. Instead, he takes out his anger on the last surviving Stark, even though Tony didn't know anything about it until they met in Monaco. For all intents and purposes, the Stark family are entirely blameless in the Vanko downfall, but Ivan's need for retribution blinds him to the obvious truth. Our other example, on the other hand, has motivations which are horrifyingly relatable. The slights against Helmut Zemo are totally real, and his rage is completely justified. Sokovia didn't ask for the hell that got rained down upon them, but it came anyway. What's worse, it was Tony Stark's fault. Many people died because of what Stark made, and it's so easy to write it off as collateral damage, but then you see the face of the man who gets stuck with that brand. Zemo is by far one of the most complex villains in the MCU simply because, much like the Clash of the Accords, you can totally sympathize and understand his motivations, even to an extent that they are justified. Zemo himself admits that he never wanted to take the bloodier path, but he was more than prepared to take it. His plans were precise and calculated to the slightest decimal, and for all intents and purposes, he won. He's arguably the only villain in all comic book movies who wins in the end. By the end of Civil War, the Avengers, as we know them, have dissolved, Cap and his crew are in hiding, the government is now keeping a tighter leash on enhanced beings, and though he doesn't know it, open the Earth up to a greater threat. A bit redundant at this juncture, but once again, it has been said that absolute power corrupts absolutely, and the MCU has presented us with a wealth of villains who succumb to said corruption, and the reason all of them give in? Addiction. Power is something everyone aspires to obtain, and there is no high greater. For these examples, we're going to ascend from a more down-to-earth example to the most gargantuan, starting with Emil Blonsky in The Incredible Hulk. Blonsky is established early on to be a career soldier. He lives for the challenge and he's eager to push himself to the limit because he thrives on the rush his life provides him. You can see it in the soda factory when he first encounters the Hulk. When he sees that Hulk and discovers that this paragon of strength and might is nothing more than a mild-mannered scientist, he starts to feel the itch. Blonsky even alludes to the notion that if he could have all of his expertise in the body of a younger man, that would be a force to be reckoned with. Foolishly, General Ross indulges this and starts giving him injections of a failed version of the super soldier serum. This winds up making Blonsky stronger, but it also makes him hungry for more. After swiftly and miraculously recovering from getting mangled by the Hulk, Blonsky coerces Dr. Stern into hitting him with gamma radiation, becoming the Abomination. Blonsky's aim is simple, but his personality is akin to that of a junkie. As you can see, the greater high he obtains from the power given to him, the more impulsive and irrational he becomes, to the point where more power is all he'll ever want. To him, it's the only thing that matters. On the next tier, we have the Red Skull from Captain America: The First Avenger, another person who desires to take his lust for power to the level of the gods, to the extent where he endeavors to harness a seemingly godlike technology to obtain it. He believes that if it is possible for man to elevate himself to such a height, why shouldn't he? Red Skull is considerably more controlled than Blonsky, but no less devious. When you think of his rise to power, you can see that he believes that because he is a man of considerable intellect, he should be injected with the serum. After that, he should lead an organization that is so superior even Hitler was terrified by his power. Sure, he dresses it up as a financial concern, but we all know what it really is. Schmidt aspires to bring Hydra out of Hitler's shadow. Granted, Red Skull is at his core a conqueror villain, but the thing that makes a conqueror terrifying is his capacity for ruthlessness, and Hydra very nearly destroyed the eastern seaboard in one strike. The only person he would hold in any sort of esteem is the one person he deems unworthy of the power, simply because Captain America uses his power to protect those that Red Skull considers tiny and pointless. But the most colossal example is also one of the more recent additions to the MCU villains roster. We're talking about Ego, the Living Planet. Ego is a horrifying example of when you have godlike power and you are very bored. Well, when you're a celestial being who can control physical reality by sheer will, and have crafted a beautiful planet as a result, of course you're gonna think that every planet should be like this. For what seems like an eternity, Ego searched for any sort of life, and when he found it, he was so thoroughly unimpressed. In Ego's colossal brain, he raised the standard so high that no other form of life could compare to it, so it stood to reason that every planet should be him. He proceeds to seed portions of himself on various planets all over the galaxy, then conceive an heir from one of the locals who could be genetically compatible and be used as an energy source for Ego's mass terraforming project. If it wasn't terrifying enough that the Guardians have to fight a living planet, we had to think upon one point that actually makes Ego one of the most despicable villains in the MCU. In order for his plan to work, Ego had a lot of children, and remember, he had been at this for a while, and no other child would do until Peter Quill came along. Thousands of years went by. Think about it. That's an obscene pile of adolescent skeletons he's got in his closet. Just let it sink in. In order to find Quill, Ego slaughtered hundreds of thousands of his own children to reach this point. Let's also not forget the very real possibility that he may have also killed thousands of mothers along with them. Hell, he killed Peter Quill's mom, and he actually seemed to love her. So when you get right down to it, when you let power get to your head, that can be a dangerous thing. But it's a head that's the size of a planet. Now that's just plain cataclysmic. When it comes to war, history tends to be biased depending on the victor, which makes any survivors from the opposition a bit ornery at the way the world sees them. So you can imagine how bitter Hydra tends to be about how they're perceived in the annals of history. Well, the natural approach to talk about Hydra would be to focus on Alexander Pierce in The Winter Soldier, and trust me, we'll get to him. It seems important to focus on the group as a whole and how they have actually worked as a consistent threat in the MCU. And to do that, let's look at what they reflect in our own history. When the Allies defeated the Nazis in World War II, a proper cinematic ending would imply that this would be the end of them. Unfortunately, with the world as it is, now we know that not only are they still around, a more horrifying thought is, like Hydra, they may have taken a more covert approach to attaining power. Huh. Yeah. It even works that Hydra found ways to make their enterprise more appealing. The brilliance of The Winter Soldier is the fact that this film utilizes the presence of Hydra as a satirical portrait of how we are so susceptible to manipulation. When we are presented with a charismatic face, that's where Alexander Pierce works so well. We meet him and he's charming, gutsy, and though he's an old soul, he understands the necessity of progress. Unfortunately, that's the devil's game. Show you an appealing picture and secretly sneak the Bad Batch under your nose. Pierce was able to use fear and uncertainty to provoke the World Security Council into building Project Insight, little knowing of its true intention. In the pantheon of MCU villains, Hydra is the one that presents itself as more of an idea, a construct, and the terror of it comes from the revelations of who follows that ideal and what they'll do for it. So with all that, what made Loki such a hot item? When you think about it, he's never really been a physical challenge for some of his enemies. In fact, many times he seems more likable than loathsome. One could very well theorize that it's because we've had more time to develop him. It makes sense, many of the villains on the Netflix shows, particularly Fisk, Kilgrave, Cottonmouth, and Black Mariah, all benefited from the time they're given in a TV series format. Maybe audiences just want to get to know our villains better, and recently Marvel seems to have taken a cue from that. Just recently, Adrian Toomes, aka The Vulture, has garnered praise as an MCU villain, and you can indeed attribute it to the amount of time and attention dedicated to getting to know the character. In fact, one of the moments in Spider-Man Homecoming that raised the stakes came from when we found out more about him. It seems that many of the villains are going to wind up benefiting from extra time given to him. Sure, Zemo is incarcerated, but he's not dead, and he could still pose a problem if the Avengers reform. We already know Claw isn't going to let a missing arm keep him from trying to plunder Wakanda again. And let's not forget, Mordo is not particularly happy with sorcerers right now, and Dormammu is sure not going to let his bargain stand still. We also know the Sovereign haven't given up their bid for revenge against the Guardians, and then there's this guy. Unless you notice, this man is getting some serious build-up, and if you think his villainy is going to be on the same level as the aforementioned examples, oh, then my friend, you're in for a surprise. So, now that you've taken some time to delve into the deeper motivations of the MCU villains, one can hope that you can appreciate what these villains represent on storytelling terms. A villain's intimidation level isn't always going to be on the surface. The importance of a villain is the way they challenge the hero. After all, the reason why we love these heroes is that we care about their struggle and want to see them persevere, but a hero's challenge isn't always physical. The villains challenge their heroes on multiple levels, and proving that a victory isn't just won by beating the hell out of your enemy. Unless you're the Hulk, then it's freaking hilarious. Did you find this examination illuminating? Feel the desire to lend your own insights into the mix? Then feel free to place your thoughts in the comments below. And for more addictive content on Narcotic Casserole, we implore you to click subscribe, and thou shalt be served.